At his father's wedding, young Ben feels an overwhelming need to speak up, sensing something isn't quite right about his dad's fiancée, Samantha. As he steps forward to reveal what he's discovered, the ceremony takes an unexpected turn, leaving everyone in shock. If you're intrigued by this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to see more content just like this. The sun shone brightly over the hillside villa, casting golden light across rows of white chairs and draped flowers, filling the air with a delicate floral scent. Guests in elegant attire mingled under the Californian sky, their voices blending in a murmur of excitement and expectation. It was a perfect day for a wedding. Tom adjusted his tie nervously as he stood near the archway decorated with white roses, his gaze fixed on the ocean view beyond the villa's grounds. It was hard to believe that after years of loneliness and single parenthood, he'd met someone who made him want to start again. Samantha had come into his life almost as if by fate, a confident, beautiful woman who had quickly swept him off his feet. Tom felt young and alive again. And even though he'd hesitated at first, worried about what his teenage son, Ben, might think, he finally decided to take the plunge. Samantha was everything he wanted in a partner. She was the fresh start he needed. He only wished Ben could feel the same way. On the opposite side of the lawn, Ben stood stiffly, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his suit pants as he scanned the scene with a tense expression. This day should have been one of celebration, but to him, it felt more like the opening of a terrible mistake. His father might have found happiness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just that his father was moving on after losing his mother, though that did sting. There was something about Samantha herself, a darkness he sensed, something hidden that only he seemed to notice. "Man, you look like you're at a funeral instead of a wedding," Jake muttered beside him, giving Ben a playful nudge. Jake had been his best friend since grade school, and today he was here not only as a guest but as Ben's anchor. Ben forced a weak smile, his eyes drifting toward the pavilion where Samantha was laughing and greeting guests. Her polished exterior, the perfect fiancée, sweet and loving, never wavered around Tom. But Ben had caught glimpses of a different side, a colder, more calculating expression that left him feeling uneasy. "Jake," Ben whispered, his voice low, "there's something off about her. I don't think Dad knows her like he thinks he does." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "What are you saying? You really think she's hiding something?" Ben nodded, looking down at his shoes. "I don't know exactly. It's just, I found stuff about her online. Things that don't add up." He bit his lip, hesitating, but the words came rushing out. "I saw records of an arrest under a different name, like, she's not who she says she is." Jake's mouth fell open. "Dude, why didn't you tell your dad?" "I tried last night," Ben muttered, eyes narrowing as he watched Samantha greet more guests, her gaze occasionally flicking over to him, almost as if she was aware of his suspicions. "But he thinks I'm just jealous, or that I don't want him to move on from Mom." He wouldn't even listen. Jake let out a low whistle. "So, what are you going to do?" Ben sighed, his hands clenched in frustration. "I don't know, but I can't just let this go. I've got to find a way to talk to him, really talk to him. He has no idea what he's getting himself into." Ben's mind raced, trying to sort through the memories and encounters that had built his suspicions. Samantha's attitude with him had been strangely detached, and the way she seemed so overly attentive with Tom always felt performative. The night before, he'd overheard her on the phone when she thought she was alone, speaking in hushed tones about something being taken care of and that no one needed to know. Those words had sent a chill through him, and he couldn't sleep without at least trying to verify her background. Now, as he stood watching his dad exchange greetings with friends and family, he felt the weight of his silence pressing down on him. He had to speak up before it was too late. Suddenly, Tom noticed him from across the lawn and waved him over with a warm smile. His expression filled with a joy Ben hadn't seen in a long time. Forcing a calm appearance, Ben approached, feeling the churning pit of worry deepen as he got closer. Ready to finally welcome a new member to the family, Ben? Tom's voice was light, but there was a hint of vulnerability behind his smile. Ben could tell his father was nervous and desperately wanted his son's approval. Ben took a deep breath, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. "Yeah, Dad, about that." He hesitated, his words stumbling as he felt the enormity of what he was about to say. "Are you sure about her? I mean, do you really know her?" Tom's smile wavered, and he gave Ben a puzzled look. "What are you talking about? You know how much this means to me. Samantha makes me feel alive again, after your mom." "I never thought I'd feel this way." His tone softened, eyes brimming with hope. "Your mother would have wanted me to be happy." The weight of those words settled over Ben like a dark cloud. Tom's happiness was the last thing he wanted to ruin, but he also couldn't ignore the warning bells going off in his mind. Ben's gaze drifted over to Samantha, who was now glancing in his direction, her eyes narrowing with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Okay, Dad," Ben murmured, forcing himself to nod even as his heart raced with dread. He didn't have long to make his decision. Either he spoke up and risked shattering his father's happiness, or he stayed silent, hoping he was wrong about Samantha. But something deep down told him this was his last chance to act. As the music began to play and the guests settled into their seats, Ben knew he had to make a choice, and he knew that, one way or another, today would change everything. The days leading up to the wedding had been uneasy ones for Ben. While his father had been busy finalizing wedding plans with Samantha, Ben's suspicions about her had only grown. Small incidents and glimpses of behavior that felt out of place continued to add up in his mind, painting a picture he couldn't ignore. And yet, without concrete evidence, he felt trapped in his own doubt, unsure of what to believe or how to protect his father. One night, about a week before the wedding, Ben lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his concerns. He remembered how Samantha would sometimes slip into another room to take phone calls or suddenly end a conversation when he entered. Her behavior had left him uneasy, but it was a conversation he'd overheard that pushed him over the edge. He'd been in the kitchen late at night, searching for a snack, when he heard Samantha's voice, muffled through the door to his dad's office. Her tone was hushed, sharp in a way he'd never heard before. Ben slowed his footsteps, listening. "Of course he has no idea," she had said, her voice tinged with something dark. "I'm handling it. No one suspects anything. Trust me. By the end of next week, everything will be set. Just make sure you're ready." Ben's heart had dropped. His dad? Unaware of something she was planning? The conversation had ended abruptly, and Ben hadn't been able to get a word of it out of his mind. The next morning, she'd greeted him as though nothing was out of the ordinary, her smile polite but distant. The unease lingered, growing into a steady alarm that demanded action. The following day, he shared his worries with Jake. "I don't trust her. Jake, I don't think she's who she says she is." Jake studied him carefully. "You've got to find something more concrete, man. It sounds bad, but your dad's not going to call off his wedding just because you feel something's off. What if you look her up online?" Ben's mind raced. "I thought about that, but do you really think I should?" Jake gave him a steady look. "It sounds like you need answers, or you'll regret not knowing." That night, alone in his room, Ben found himself typing Samantha's name into a search engine. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A few social media profiles, a handful of photos, but as he looked closer, Ben began to notice inconsistencies. The details of her background places she claimed to have worked, her education, didn't add up. There were gaps, strange omissions, and pieces that didn't fit. He searched further, and with a growing sense of dread, he found an arrest record from a different state under a name, suspiciously similar to Samantha's. The charge had been for fraud and identity theft. Ben stared at the screen, feeling his stomach twist. The photo was blurry but unmistakably her. This was more than a red flag. This was a full-blown alarm. How had his dad fallen for this? Ben printed the page, folding it into his pocket. He could hardly sleep that night, wondering how he would break the news to his dad. He'd thought of dozens of ways to bring it up, but each time he imagined his dad's face, a mixture of hope and joy at finally moving on after his mother's passing, Ben's resolve weakened. And what if he was wrong? What if this was all a coincidence? The following day, he tried to talk to his dad over breakfast. Tom was reviewing some final details for the wedding, his face lit with an excitement Ben hadn't seen in years. "Dad," Ben began, carefully choosing his words, Have you ever wondered if Samantha has maybe not told you everything about her past?" Tom looked up, slightly amused. "Ben, if this is about her moving in with us, I know it's an adjustment, but she's really done her best to make you feel comfortable." Ben shook his head, feeling the frustration bubble up. "No, Dad, really, do you know everything about her?" Tom's smile faltered, and he looked at Ben with a mixture of confusion and concern. "What is it, son? You're not jealous, are you?" Ben felt the sting of those words, even though he knew his dad didn't mean them that way. "It's not that. I've noticed some strange things. I think she's hiding something." Tom let out a sigh, putting his fork down. "Ben, I know this hasn't been easy. After everything we went through with your mother, I understand why it's hard to let someone else in. But Samantha has been nothing but supportive and loving. She's tried to help us heal. Can you at least give her a chance?" Ben opened his mouth to say more, but he stopped, unsure if his father would believe him. He wanted to tell him about the arrest record, about the gaps he'd found in her background, but the words felt heavy and impossible to form. How could he convince his dad without breaking his heart? "Yeah, okay," Ben said finally, his voice barely a whisper. I hope you're right, Dad." Tom gave him a reassuring smile, patting his shoulder. "Trust me, Ben, she's a good woman, and she loves us both." Ben's unease didn't disappear, though. That night, as he lay in bed, he pulled out the printed record and stared at it under the dim light of his lamp. He knew he couldn't just sit back and watch his dad marry a woman who was potentially dangerous. He needed to stop this wedding, even if it meant going against his father's wishes. But the more he thought about it, the more uncertain he felt about how to do it. The night before the wedding, the villa was unusually quiet. The guests had returned to their rooms, and the only sound in the house was the low hum of distant waves and the occasional creak as the evening wind stirred the trees. Ben sat alone in his room, turning the crumpled arrest record over in his hands. He'd been carrying it with him everywhere, the damning proof of Samantha's hidden life. He couldn't shake the feeling that, if he waited until tomorrow, it would be too late. But no matter how many times he thought through what he would say to his dad, every scenario ended with the same look of disappointment on Tom's face. How could he shatter his father's happiness with only hours left until the ceremony? Yet, the thought of staying silent felt just as impossible. He had to try one more time. Checking the hall for any sign of Samantha, he quietly made his way to his dad's study, where he often found Tom unwinding before bed. Sure enough, there was his father, seated at his desk with a glass of scotch, looking through the wedding program one last time. The sight made Ben's stomach twist, knowing what he was about to do. "Dad?" Ben's voice was soft, but it seemed to break the calm in the room like a stone thrown into still water. Tom looked up, a bit surprised to see him at this hour. "Hey, Ben, what's up? Can't sleep?" Ben swallowed hard. He knew he had to get this right. "Actually, I need to talk to you about something. It's important." He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on his father's face, searching for any sign of willingness to listen. Tom's brows furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Ben's heart pounded as he unfolded the record and placed it on the desk between them. "It's about Samantha, Dad. I found something." Tom's eyes drifted down to the paper, and his expression quickly shifted from confusion to shock as he processed what he was looking at. "Ben, what is this?" Ben took a deep breath, his words coming out in a rush. "Dad, she's not who she says she is. She's lied about her name, her past, and I think she's hiding something dangerous. Look, this is an arrest record from a few years ago. It matches her background, her age, everything. I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't let you marry her without knowing." Tom's face turned pale as he looked at the record again, disbelief clouding his eyes. "Ben, I don't even know what to say. You've been going through all of this behind my back, digging into Samantha's life like this?" His tone was a mixture of shock and hurt. "I had to," Ben said, his voice pleading. "You weren't listening, and I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. She's not who she's pretending to be, Dad. What if she's just using you?" Tom looked away, shaking his head, clearly wrestling with his emotions. After a few moments, he exhaled and faced Ben with a hardened expression. "Ben, I know you miss your mom. I know this is hard for you, but Samantha isn't. She isn't the person you think she is. She's tried everything to make you feel at home, to build a life with us. Don't you think she deserves a chance?" Ben opened his mouth to protest, but he saw the pain in his dad's eyes and faltered. His father's loyalty to Samantha was stronger than any suspicion, any warning Ben could give. Tom was blinded by his hope for happiness. Finally, Ben lowered his gaze, feeling defeated. "I just want you to be safe, Dad. I want you to be happy, but I don't want you to get hurt." Tom's expression softened, and he reached out to place a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Ben, I appreciate that you're looking out for me. I really do. But sometimes we have to trust people, even if it's hard. Samantha, she makes me feel like myself again. I hope someday you'll understand." Ben nodded reluctantly, but deep down, the sense of dread only grew stronger. As he returned to his room that night, he knew he'd done everything he could. But his heart felt heavy, knowing he had failed to convince his dad. Tomorrow, he realized with a pang, he might be forced to take more drastic measures. The ceremony was going to happen, whether he was ready or not, and Ben knew, now more than ever, that he couldn't let this wedding proceed without trying one last time to stop it. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a wedding. The villa bustled with activity as guests began to arrive, each of them unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. White flowers lined the walkway, a string quartet played softly in the background, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and the soft chatter of anticipation. For everyone, it was a day of celebration, a union meant to bring joy. For Ben, however, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Standing off to the side, Ben watched as his father made his rounds, greeting friends and family who had flown in from all over the country. Tom's face was lit with excitement, his smile warm and genuine as he introduced his fiancée to various guests. Samantha, dressed in a form-fitting, elegant wedding gown, radiated grace as she charmed everyone she met. Ben's stomach twisted as he watched her, his suspicion hardening into a fierce determination. He could feel the moment slipping away, and the closer they came to the ceremony, the more urgently he felt he had to act. Jake approached him, a serious expression on his face. "You okay, man?" he asked quietly. "You look like you're about to explode." Ben glanced around, making sure no one could overhear them. "I can't let this happen, Jake. I tried to tell him last night, but he wouldn't listen. He doesn't see her like I do." Jake nodded slowly, glancing toward the wedding arch where Samantha and Tom would soon be standing. "So what are you going to do? It's almost time." "I don't know yet," Ben admitted, his voice tight with frustration. "But I can't just watch. I'll have to do something. If I don't, who knows what she'd do to him." Before Jake could respond, the music shifted, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests took their seats, the excited whispers and laughter falling into an expectant silence. Ben's heart pounded as he saw his father make his way to the front, positioning himself under the arch with a proud smile. Samantha appeared on the opposite side, her gaze sweeping over the guests before landing briefly, almost challengingly, on Ben. He felt a chill run down his spine as their eyes met. She knew he was watching her, and she knew he wouldn't dare to act. As the officiant began to speak, Ben's pulse quickened, his mind racing. Every word, every smile his father directed at Samantha felt like a betrayal of the truth. How could his dad not see through her act? All he needed was one solid moment to expose her, one chance to make his father realize he was on the verge of a disastrous mistake. The officiant's voice broke through his thoughts. If anyone here has a reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. Ben felt a surge of adrenaline. This was his last chance. He stood abruptly, his heart hammering as every pair of eyes turned toward him, including his father's shocked gaze. Ben? Tom's voice was strained, filled with a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. Ben felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. Dad, I'm sorry, but I can't let this happen. I've tried to tell you before, but you wouldn't listen. Samantha isn't who she says she is. She's hiding something from you. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Samantha's expression changed, her smile slipping ever so slightly. She quickly regained her composure, but Ben noticed the flash of anger in her eyes. She turned to Tom, her voice calm but sharp. Tom, he's upset. He's still grieving, and he's not ready to see you move on. Please, don't let him ruin this day. Ben felt his frustration bubble over. I'm not upset because of Mom. This has nothing to do with that. I did my research, and I found proof. Samantha has a criminal record, Dad. She's been arrested before under a different name. She's not who she says she is. The silence was absolute. Tom's face shifted from anger to a kind of pained confusion, glancing between Ben and Samantha. The guests sat frozen, many looking shocked, others whispering in alarm. Samantha's calm facade wavered. She looked at Tom, her voice now filled with a forced, brittle warmth. Tom, you know me. You know this isn't true, she said, a pleading note in her voice. He's just a boy trying to keep his family together. He doesn't understand. But Ben wouldn't back down. He stepped forward, his voice rising. It's the truth, Dad. You have to believe me. I found the records. She's lied to you about everything. Tom looked at Ben, his face a mix of hurt and hesitation. He wanted to believe his son, but the risk of trusting Ben's accusation was equally as great as the risk of dismissing it. Slowly, he turned to Samantha, a question in his eyes, and Ben saw Samantha's gaze flicker, her composed mask slipping. Is any of this true? Tom asked quietly, his voice trembling. For a long moment, Samantha said nothing, her expression frozen. Then, as though realizing the weight of the silence, she forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Tom, please. This is absurd. But her hesitance was all the proof Ben needed, and now Tom saw it too. The audience began to murmur, and Samantha's face hardened as she turned away, looking around as though calculating an escape. A flash of fear crossed her face, quickly masked by anger. Ben's pulse raced. Samantha, his gut told him, was far from finished. The murmurs in the audience grew louder as guests exchanged startled glances, some watching Samantha with narrowed eyes, others casting pitying looks at Tom, who stood frozen under the wedding arch. The officiant shifted uncomfortably, his gaze bouncing between the bride and groom, uncertain whether to continue or step back. Ben's heart pounded as he watched his father grapple with the situation, caught between loyalty to his son and his trust in Samantha. He could see the hurt in his father's eyes as he looked at Samantha, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had nearly married. For a moment, Ben worried his father might side with her after all. But then Tom turned to him, a resigned expression on his face. Ben, Tom said slowly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Do you have proof of what you're saying? Ben nodded, and before he could second-guess himself, he pulled the crumpled record from his pocket. He took a few steps forward and held it out for his father. Tom's hand shook slightly as he took the paper, and as his eyes scanned the document, the color drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Samantha stepped toward him, her voice smooth, almost soothing. Tom, this is ridiculous. This piece of paper doesn't mean anything. People make mistakes. This was years ago. I told you I had a rough past, and you said it didn't matter. Are you really going to let your son ruin what we have because of a misunderstanding? But Tom wasn't looking at her. His eyes were locked onto the arrest record, processing the reality of it, the weight of Ben's words settling heavily on him. The silence stretched, and then, finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. You lied to me, Samantha, he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. You told me you'd been honest from the start. I trusted you. Samantha's expression faltered, her patience wearing thin. Her face hardened as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. Tom, she said, her tone sharper now, you need to understand that this has nothing to do with us. This is just a kid's attempt to hold on to his family. He doesn't want you to be happy, Tom. That's all this is. Ben felt a rush of anger at her words. He stepped forward, his voice firm. No, this isn't about keeping my family together. It's about making sure my dad doesn't get hurt. I'm not the one lying here. You are. The guests gasped, some of them watching Samantha with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. For a moment, she looked around, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for a lifeline, for anyone who might stand by her side. But all she found were suspicious glares and raised eyebrows. Then, just as quickly as her resolve had faltered, Samantha's face settled into an unreadable mask. Her eyes, which had once looked so warm and kind to Tom, were now cold and calculating. She turned back to him, her voice dropping low. Fine, she said, barely louder than a whisper. Believe whatever you want, Tom, but remember this moment. When you're alone and miserable, remember that it was your son who couldn't let you be happy. Tom flinched at the coldness in her tone, and Ben felt a flash of triumph, knowing he'd finally broken through to his father. But before he could feel any relief, Samantha's expression changed again. Her face twisted in anger, and she took a step back, casting a frantic glance toward the exit. Maybe I made a mistake, she muttered, her voice bitter. I should have left this all behind when I had the chance. In a flash, Samantha turned on her heel, and without another word, she began striding quickly down the aisle, her head held high. A wave of whispers and shocked exclamations rippled through the audience as she brushed past them, her elegant gown swishing around her like a storm. Ben's heart raced as he watched her go. Something in the way she moved fast, with a sense of urgency, set him on edge. Instinctively, he knew this wasn't over. Dad, Ben said urgently, grabbing Tom's arm. We need to stop her. She could be dangerous. Tom looked at him, dazed and uncertain, but Ben's determination spurred him into action. Together, they moved quickly down the aisle, following the trail Samantha had left in her wake. Several guests called out in confusion, their voices blending into a cacophony of disbelief. They caught up to Samantha just as she reached the entryway. Ben could see the panic in her eyes as she realized she was cornered. For the first time, her composure cracked, and her eyes flashed with something dark and unsettling. Don't touch me, she spat, her voice low and venomous as she looked between Tom and Ben. You have no idea what you're doing. Tom took a step back, his face a mixture of shock and sadness. Samantha, who are you? Really? I thought I knew you. Samantha's expression turned cold, and for the first time, Ben saw her for what she truly was, someone who had been using his father, who'd seen him as nothing more than a pawn in whatever scheme she had been planning. Without another word, Samantha shoved past them, making a beeline for the main doors. Ben's heart pounded, a sense of urgency surging through him. His father didn't deserve this. He couldn't let her walk away, not after everything she had done. Dad, we need to call the police, he said, his voice shaking. She's dangerous, and if we let her go, who knows what she'd do next? Tom hesitated, looking down at the crumpled arrest record in his hand and then back at Ben. Finally, he nodded, reaching into his pocket to pull out his phone. His hand trembled as he dialed, the enormity of the situation beginning to sink in. The call connected, and Tom's voice was filled with a shaky resolve. Yes, this is Tom Jackson. I need to report an incident at my property. As he explained the situation to the dispatcher, Ben felt a sense of relief mixed with lingering dread. They'd exposed Samantha for who she really was, but he knew deep down that this wasn't the end. Samantha's secrets ran deep, and Ben couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. As he stood beside his father, listening to the call, Ben felt a new bond forming between them, one built on trust and a shared resolve to face whatever came next together. Samantha's heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors as she stormed through the villa's grand hallway, her veil and train flowing behind her in a trail of white lace. Her graceful demeanor had transformed into something frantic, almost animalistic, as she headed for the main entrance, leaving Tom and Ben in her wake. Ben's mind raced as he watched her retreat, aware that with every second they hesitated, Samantha was slipping further from their grasp. "Dad, we can't just let her leave," Ben urged, grabbing Tom's arm. Tom seemed rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with shock. He looked as though he'd aged years in the last few minutes, the heartbreak and betrayal etched into every line on his face. But Ben's urgency jolted him back to the present, and he gave a brief nod, determination flickering in his eyes. They hurried after Samantha, weaving through the guests who had begun to stand, some whispering, others watching with expressions of curiosity and alarm. A few reached out to Tom, but he brushed them aside, his focus fixed solely on catching up with the woman he had once trusted with his heart. "Samantha!" he called, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and anger. "Stop, we need to talk." But Samantha didn't slow down. Instead, she quickened her pace, glancing back over her shoulder with an expression that was equal parts fear and fury. She pushed through the doors, emerging into the bright afternoon sun, and broke into a near run toward the parking area where the guests' cars were lined up along the cobblestone driveway. By the time Ben and Tom reached the doors, Samantha was already several yards ahead of them, her figure shrinking as she darted toward her car. Ben's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched her slip one hand into her dress and retrieve a small, silver keychain. He knew she was close to getting away. "I'll go after her," Ben said, already moving forward, but his father grabbed his arm, stopping him. "No, Ben, if she's really dangerous, we shouldn't get too close. Let's wait for the police to arrive." Tom's face was taut with tension, torn between his need for answers and the realization that Samantha was someone far more dangerous than he'd imagined. "Dad, if we don't stop her now, she'll be long gone before the police even get here." Ben insisted, his voice a mix of urgency and frustration. Tom hesitated, but Ben's words struck a chord. After a brief moment, he released his grip on Ben's arm. "Be careful." Ben nodded and sprinted across the courtyard, weaving between the cars in pursuit of Samantha. His steps echoed on the cobblestones as he approached, his eyes fixed on her as she struggled to unlock her car. The closer he got, the more he could see the rage etched into her features. Gone was the composed, polished woman his father had fallen for. In her place stood someone ruthless, someone who would stop at nothing to protect her secrets. "Samantha!" Ben shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness of the courtyard. She froze, turning to face him, her eyes narrowed. "Get out of here, Ben," she hissed, her tone sharp as glass. "You've done enough." Ben squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "I'm not going anywhere. You lied to my dad, used him, and you think you can just walk away? It doesn't work like that." Samantha's lips twisted into a cold, mocking smile. "You think you're a hero, don't you? But you're just a scared little boy who couldn't handle someone else making your father happy. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ben felt a chill run through him, but he didn't waver. He took a step forward, blocking her path to the car. "I know enough. You lied to him, hid your past, and you were going to marry him without ever telling the truth. You don't get to walk away from this." Samantha's eyes darted toward the road beyond the driveway as if calculating her options. Her fingers tightened around the car key in her hand, and Ben suddenly realized she might be more desperate than he'd thought. He took a cautious step back, keeping his gaze on her, aware that he was treading dangerous ground. For a moment, they stood locked in a silent standoff, each waiting for the other to make a move. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tension, and Ben felt a surge of relief. The police were close. Samantha's face contorted, and she took a step back, her gaze flicking from Ben to the road. "You really think this is over?" she sneered, her voice laced with venom. "You've ruined everything, and you're going to regret it. Both of you." Ben clenched his fists, standing his ground. "Maybe, but at least I won't have to live with the lie you tried to build." The sirens grew louder, and a police car appeared at the entrance of the villa, its lights flashing. Samantha's bravado wavered, her defiance crumbling as she watched the car pull into the driveway. For a split second, Ben saw the fear flash across her face, raw and unmasked. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. Tom joined Ben, his face grim as he nodded toward Samantha, signaling to the officers. One of them approached her cautiously. "Samantha Evans?" the officer asked, his voice steady. "We received a report regarding you. We need you to come with us for questioning." Samantha's face was a mask of barely contained fury, but she forced a smile, lifting her hands in a gesture of surrender. "Of course, officer. There must be some misunderstanding." The officer nodded, gesturing toward the police car. Samantha turned and cast one last venomous look at Ben and Tom, her eyes promising retribution. But Ben held her gaze, refusing to flinch. As the officers led her to the car, Ben felt a weight lift from his chest. The tension and dread that had haunted him in the days leading up to the wedding began to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of relief. It was over. They had exposed Samantha's lies, and now she would face the consequences. Tom placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, his grip firm but filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. But you saved me from something I would have regretted for the rest of my life." Ben looked up at his father, the relief mirrored in his own expression. "I'm just glad you're safe, Dad." Together, they watched as the police car pulled away, taking Samantha and her web of lies with it. As the police car disappeared down the villa's driveway, a heavy silence settled over the courtyard. Guests, who had witnessed the chaotic scene from afar, stood murmuring in small groups, their voices a low hum of confusion and shock. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Tom, while others eyed Ben with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Tom and Ben remained standing side by side, both exhausted and numb from the whirlwind of emotions they'd just endured. Tom pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at it in silence for a moment before he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to let everyone know the wedding's off." His voice cracked and he looked down, a sense of weariness overtaking him. Ben placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "You don't have to explain anything right now, Dad. They'll understand. The important thing is that you're safe." Tom nodded, but his face was clouded with regret and pain. I thought she was the one, Ben. After everything we've been through, I really thought she would bring happiness back into our lives." Ben looked at his father, his own heart heavy with sympathy. He'd been so focused on exposing Samantha's lies that he hadn't truly considered the depth of his father's feelings. Tom had been ready to open his heart again, and now all that hope had been shattered. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ben said quietly. "I know you wanted this to work out. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't let her hurt you either." Tom looked at his son, a mixture of sadness and gratitude in his eyes. "You did the right thing, Ben. I should have seen it myself, but I was too caught up in what I wanted to believe. You saved me from making a terrible mistake." Just then, one of the officers returned, having finished speaking with the remaining guests. He approached Tom and Ben, his face serious but kind. "Mr. Jackson will be conducting a thorough investigation. From what we've gathered so far, it looks like Ms. Evans has been involved in a series of fraudulent schemes in multiple states. We'll be contacting you in the coming days as we go through the details." Tom nodded, a weary look crossing his face. "Thank you, officer. I I just never imagined." The officer offered him a small, understanding nod. "It's more common than you'd think. People like her often prey on those who've gone through loss or trauma. They look for vulnerability." Ben felt a surge of anger at the officer's words. The thought that Samantha had targeted his father on purpose, seeing him as nothing more than an easy mark, sickened him. But he took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the relief that it was over. Samantha was finally out of their lives. The officer handed Tom his card. "If you remember anything else, or if there's anything we can do, don't hesitate to reach out." "Thank you," Tom murmured, tucking the card into his jacket pocket. As the officer walked away, Tom let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the situation finally sank in. He turned to Ben, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, I guess this wasn't the wedding we'd planned, huh?" Ben managed a small smile in return, though he could feel the exhaustion settling in. "No, but it might be for the best. Now you can start fresh, without someone trying to take advantage of you." Tom nodded, his gaze drifting out over the ocean beyond the villa. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought. The lines on his face softened as he absorbed the peaceful view. Then he looked back at Ben, his expression resolute. "You're right. I've been so focused on trying to find happiness again that I forgot what I already had." He placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "I have you, and that's enough for me." Ben felt a warmth spread through him, a reassurance that, despite everything, they would be okay. Together they had faced down a difficult truth, and now they had a chance to rebuild their lives with honesty and trust. As they walked back toward the villa, Ben glanced at his father. "So, what now?" Tom gave a small shrug, his face lighting up with a hint of his usual humor. "Maybe I'll take a break from dating for a while, or at least do a thorough background check next time." Ben laughed, the sound breaking through the tension and filling the courtyard with a sense of hope. For the first time since Samantha had entered their lives, they could see a future free from deception. It wasn't the ending they'd expected, but it was one that felt like a new beginning. The villa felt strangely empty without Samantha, her presence having left a shadow that was only now beginning to lift. Guests filtered out gradually, many stopping to offer Tom a few words of support or a sympathetic handshake. By early evening, the courtyard was quiet, the string quartet and flower arrangements standing unused. A bittersweet reminder of the day that could have been. Ben and Tom remained inside the villa, sitting together in silence. The events of the day had left them drained but strangely at peace. Just when Ben thought the worst was behind them, there was a firm knock on the door. He exchanged a glance with his father before getting up to answer. Outside stood two officers, the same ones who had taken Samantha into custody earlier. "Mr. Jackson," one of the officers greeted Tom with a nod. "We have some information regarding Ms. Evans that we thought you might want to know." Tom and Ben ushered them inside, tension returning to the room as the officers took seats across from them. "We conducted a preliminary background check on Ms. Evans," one officer began, his tone steady but somber. "The truth is, she's not just involved in a few isolated cases of fraud. She's part of a larger network that's been targeting vulnerable individuals across several states, often recent widows or widowers. This group has been operating for years under the radar, and Samantha Evans is a significant part of it." Tom sat back, his face a mixture of disbelief and horror. "You're saying she was part of a criminal organization?" The officer nodded. "Yes, sir. Samantha Evans is one of her many aliases. She has a history of using multiple identities to access financial records, gain access to assets, and convince people to invest money or sign over property. We suspect she's used at least 5 different identities over the past decade." Ben's hands tightened into fists as he listened, each word confirming his worst fears. He'd known something was wrong, but he hadn't imagined the depth of her deception. "What would she have done?" Ben asked quietly, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "If we hadn't stopped her?" The second officer leaned forward, his expression grave. "Based on our experience with similar cases, she likely would have attempted to access any financial assets tied to Mr. Jackson's name. Once trust is established, perpetrators often convince their victims to invest in fraudulent opportunities. Or worse, they forge documents to take control of property and bank accounts. Tom looked away, his jaw clenched as he processed the betrayal. He had nearly handed over his life to her, blinded by his desire to move on. The realization was both painful and humbling. After a pause, he turned back to the officers. "Thank you for letting me know. I still can't believe it. She seemed so genuine. So kind." The officer nodded with understanding. People like her are exceptionally skilled at building trust. They rely on it. They observe, adapt, and blend in, targeting those who have experienced loss or hardship. It's their way of exploiting others for financial gain, and unfortunately, it's a reality we deal with often. The words felt heavy, almost surreal. Tom shook his head slowly, a bitter smile crossing his face. "All this time, I thought she was helping me rebuild my life, when really, she was tearing it apart from the inside." The first officer nodded, then glanced at Ben. "You did well, son. Not everyone would have noticed what you did. If you hadn't found that record, things might have turned out very differently." Ben swallowed, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. He'd done what he needed to protect his dad, but he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt for the pain he'd caused. The wedding, the heartbreak, none of this was what he had wanted for his father. Tom seemed to sense Ben's turmoil and reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't ever feel guilty, Ben. You did the right thing. You saved me from something I was too blind to see." The officer gave a small, understanding nod. It's hard to protect the people we care about, especially in situations like these. But Mr. Jackson, you're lucky to have a son who is looking out for you. The officers exchanged a few more details with Tom, providing him with their contact information and promising to update him as the investigation progressed. As they rose to leave, Tom stood up and shook their hands, his gratitude evident despite the weight of what they had just shared. "Thank you again," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. Once the officers had left, Ben and Tom remained seated, the villa around them eerily quiet. The events of the day seemed to hang in the air, each revelation settling over them like an unwelcome shadow. Ben broke the silence, his voice hesitant. "Dad, are you going to be okay?" Tom took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as he looked around, taking in the remnants of the day, the empty flower arrangements, the unused table settings, and the rows of untouched chairs outside. It was supposed to have been a new beginning, but instead, it had been a hard lesson. "I will be, son," he replied finally, offering Ben a small, reassuring smile. "It'll take time, but we're stronger than this." Ben nodded, feeling a quiet sense of relief. For the first time since Samantha had entered their lives, he believed that they were free from the shadow she had cast. The deception, the lies, the manipulation, it was all over now. They sat in silence a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I think I'll need to take some time to figure things out. But I do know one thing, I'm not going to waste another minute on people who don't value honesty and trust. We have each other, and that's more than enough for me." Ben felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of comfort and security that had been missing for so long. His father's words reassured him that, despite everything, they would rebuild their lives stronger and more aware than before. The villa grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the once bustling courtyard. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Ben and Tom sat side by side, ready to face whatever came next, together. The days following the wedding that never was passed in a blur. Friends and family called often, their sympathy genuine, and many dropped by to show their support. But Tom found himself turning down visitors, opting instead to spend his time quietly with Ben, reflecting on all that had happened. For Ben, the house felt strangely different. Without Samantha's presence, there was a peace he hadn't felt in months. a calm that came from knowing his father was finally safe. He had worried at first that Tom might withdraw or even regret Ben's actions. But each day Tom seemed lighter, his laughter a little more frequent, his voice a little more like the dad Ben had always known. One afternoon, as they sat together in the backyard, Tom looked over at Ben, his gaze serious but filled with warmth. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened." Ben nodded, unsure of what to say. He'd been careful not to bring up the wedding unless Tom wanted to talk about it, but he couldn't deny the relief he felt seeing his dad finally moving forward. Tom took a deep breath. "I can't believe I missed the signs, Ben. I thought I was smarter than that I'd know if someone was lying to me. But I was so caught up in wanting to find happiness again, wanting to give us both a fresh start, that I ignored every warning. I ignored you." "Dad, it's okay," Ben replied, shifting in his chair. "You weren't trying to hurt anyone. You just wanted to be happy. There's nothing wrong with that." Tom gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe, but I lost sight of the most important thing. I forgot that I already had happiness right here with you. I didn't need to search for it in anyone else." Ben looked down, feeling a rush of emotions. For so long, he'd been afraid his father would never feel complete without someone to replace his mom. But hearing those words, he knew they were finally going to be okay. Tom continued, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've been there for me, Ben, even when I didn't want to hear the truth. You were strong enough to do what I couldn't, and I'll never forget that. I'm sorry for not trusting you sooner. I'll never make that mistake again." Ben shook his head, a faint smile on his face. "You don't have to apologize, Dad. You were just trying to move on." "We both were, I guess." Tom reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "But we don't have to do it alone. We've got each other, and that's enough." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each taking comfort in the unspoken bond between them. For the first time since his mom had passed, Ben felt that the fractured pieces of their lives were finally beginning to come together. They didn't need anyone else to fill the space his mom had left. They just needed to learn how to hold on to each other. After a while, Tom spoke up, his voice lighter. "I've been thinking we need a change of scenery. Maybe a trip, just the two of us. We could use a fresh start, something to remind us what's really important." Ben's face brightened, his mind already buzzing with possibilities. "That sounds perfect. Where were you thinking?" Tom shrugged, a grin spreading across his face. "Anywhere that doesn't involve a wedding. Maybe we could finally go on that road trip we always talked about. Just you, me, and the open road." Ben laughed, the sound carrying into the warm afternoon air. "That sounds amazing, Dad." The idea of a road trip felt like the final step in their healing process. They would leave behind the remnants of Samantha's deception, and instead of looking back, they would look forward together, free of secrets and lies. As they planned out possible routes and destinations, a new energy filled the air between them, the bond between father and son stronger than ever. They didn't need anyone else to complete their family. The two of them, together, were enough. A few weeks later, Tom and Ben loaded their suitcases into the back of Tom's SUV, ready to set out on the long-awaited road trip. They had mapped out a route that would take them from California's coast through national parks, mountains, and quiet towns along the way. The fresh start they talked about had finally arrived, and both of them were eager to leave behind the shadows of the past months. As they pulled away from the house, Ben glanced out the window, watching familiar streets turn into open highway. He felt the thrill of possibility mixed with a quiet relief. This trip was their chance to put the pain of the past behind them and focus on each other. Tom broke the comfortable silence, his eyes on the road ahead. "You know, Ben, I've been thinking about everything we went through. I realized how lucky I am to have you by my side." Ben looked over, surprised but happy to hear his dad speaking so openly. "You've always had me, Dad. I guess I just had to remind you a little." Tom laughed, nodding in agreement. "You reminded me a lot. I don't think I'd have seen the truth about Samantha without you. I was so caught up in my own version of happiness that I missed what I already had." Ben shrugged, but he felt a swell of pride. I'm just glad you're safe, Dad. That's all that matters to me. They drove in companionable silence for a while, the world rolling by in a blur of hills and fields. The road stretched ahead of them, open and inviting, and the further they went, the lighter the atmosphere seemed to grow. Without the weight of Samantha's presence, they were free to enjoy each other's company without any underlying tension or distrust. As they drove through the winding roads of a quiet forest, Tom finally spoke again, his tone thoughtful. I think this whole experience taught me a lot. I was so focused on finding someone to complete our family that I didn't realize we were already complete. Ben nodded, understanding completely. We didn't need anyone else. We just needed to hold on to what we had. Tom smiled, a warmth in his eyes that Ben hadn't seen in a long time. You're right, and I don't plan on forgetting that. I'm done searching, Ben. I've got everything I need right here. Ben smiled, a deep feeling of peace settling over him. They'd been through so much, but finally, they were on the other side of it. This trip was more than just a getaway. It was a symbol of their commitment to each other, a promise to move forward together. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the landscape, they pulled off the road to take in the view. They stood together at the edge of a cliff, looking out over a valley bathed in golden light. In that moment, all the pain and uncertainty of the past seemed to melt away, leaving only the bond they shared. Tom placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. Thank you, son, for everything. I'm proud of you, more than you'll ever know. Ben felt his throat tighten, and he looked away, blinking back a sudden wave of emotion. Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of us. We've come a long way. As they stood side by side, watching the last light of day fade into the horizon, Ben felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. They were starting fresh, just the two of them, ready to face whatever the future held. And as the first stars began to appear in the sky above, he knew that, together, they could face anything. Their new beginning had finally arrived.